Amit Prothi, Director General Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Let me begin by asking you, Mr. Prothi, about CDRI's participation in the second G20 Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group meeting. And tell us, how does your interaction with G20 nations contribute to the broader goals and mission of CDRI?
Thank you very much for having me. So, CDRI is a coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure. The G20 has prioritized DRR by setting up a working group. CDRI has been working very closely with the presidency and the member countries to, see how we can support on knowledge, on different kinds of discussions. So, for example, in Bombay, we organized 2 side events, one with the private sector, asking them, how should they be prioritizing disaster risk reduction in their investments, in their planning and design of infrastructure. The second one we talked about was around the use of data. So how can you use data better to understand risks of disasters? For example, what is the flood areas in some places, where can landslides occur, etc., and how do you make decisions around it? So how do you use data better was one conversation, and how do you actually work with the private sector to improve financing towards resilient infrastructure was the second conversation.
So, sir, as a knowledge partner to the G20 Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group, how does CDRI intend to maximize its role in advancing disaster resilient infrastructure as well?
So thank you for that question. CDRI is doing a number of, is quite actively engaged in addressing disaster risks in the infrastructure space. Our mandate is to build capacity and undertake technical assistance. So, I'll highlight maybe 3 initiatives that are undergoing that influence how DRI needs to be thought about. For example, we're undertaking a study in the state of Odisha, where we are trying to understand how, because of climate change, wind speeds along the coast are changing. And because of that change, how do you design your electricity transmission system? So, if you have newer wind speeds now that you need to cater to, how do you do that? So that's a kind of study that we're trying to do. Another key initiative for us is in the small island development states, which are referred to as SIDS. When you look at where a lot of climate change related vulnerability lies, or where a lot of disaster vulnerability lies, you often see that SIDS are some of the most vulnerable nations in the world. So CDRI has set up an initiative called IRIS, Infrastructure for Resilient Island States, where we are offering technical assistance and capacity building to island states to strengthen their infrastructure, to strengthen the resilience of the infrastructure. Through that, we'll be supporting 13 countries in the next couple of years and beyond to look at how they should look at coastal infrastructure, how they should look at health infrastructure, how should they look at early warning systems, etc. So that's the second initiative. The third initiative is actually CDRI is building a global database of risk. So we've actually used some of the most cutting edge modeling techniques, globally acceptable modeling techniques to understand, where does risk lie globally? So what areas are more prone to earthquakes? What areas are more prone to landslides? What areas are more prone to floods, etc. And we've overlapped that with infrastructure. So transportation infrastructure, power infrastructure, water infrastructure, to try to understand, which areas are most at risk. This global database helps when we make decisions on where do we need to put in funds to improve the resilience of a system. So, currently globally such databases don't exist. So CDRI is going to be actually launching this database within the next month and a half. So the third initiative is really about data. So the first one I talked about is an example of an infrastructure system, in this case, the power infrastructure system in Odisha, and looking at how coastal resilience and changing wind speeds, etc., because of climate change are impacting that system. So this is more focused on one system. The second initiative I've talked about is IRIS, which is focused in a geographical area and looking at vulnerability in a geographical region. And the third one is around data.
Right.
So these are just examples of work that CDRI is doing that then we are also bringing to the discussions of the G20.
Right. Mr. Prothi, do also tell us, how does the CDRI plan to finance and develop disaster and climate resilient infrastructure while also ensuring a robust financing framework for disaster risk reduction?
So, CDRI is trying to work at a couple of different aspects that relate to financing that is going towards resilient infrastructure. One, there are not a lot of projects on the ground that are ready to demonstrate, to basically receive funds. So what we're trying to do is through our support, technical support to countries, to different governments, we're saying, how do you actually design a project that is resilient and then that can receive funds from financiers. These financiers could be national government funds. These financiers could be private sector. These financiers could be multilateral development banks. So there is a gap generally that there are not enough what are called bankable projects on the ground, which can receive funds. So we are looking at how do we create a pipeline of bankable.
Of course, we'll be also talking about the ecosystem that is actually based on the approach to disaster risk reduction. But Mr. Prothi, thank you very much for joining us here on the broadcast and detailing out exactly what is the strategy that you are achieving for. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us here on the broadcast.